as I read the following list of physical and psychological characteristics, please identify one or more of the following that can be used to describe you or someone you love. Blind, deaf, socially or sexually deviant, too tall, too short, mental illness, special needs, family history of violence, addiction, or crime, physical disability, over or underweight, chronic medical illness, below average IQ. At the turn of the 20th century, American eugenics scientists were developing ways to eliminate entire family lines with undesirable traits such as these from the American gene pool. As a result of my research on the topic of eugenics, I have identified three main ideas that I would like to share with you today. Included will be the definition of eugenics and its beginnings, the reasons that America was willing to accept the idea of eugenics, and American laws influenced by eugenics and their impact on the citizens of our country. Let me begin with the definition. According to Webster's Third New International Dictionary, the definition of eugenics is a science that deals with the improvement of hereditary qualities in a series of generations of a race or breed, especially by social control of human mating and reproduction, and the process or means of race improvement as by restricting mating to superior types suited to each other. At this point, if you are like me, you are having trouble believing that anything like this could have happened in our country. Normally, eugenics is equated with Hitler and the Nazi regime during World War II, but let me assure you that eugenics did indeed have a firm grip on the United States, as you will see through the following speech. Before I begin, I'd like to share my two visual aids with you. As I read the list of characteristics, one of them was chronic illness. And this particular one hits close to home because I have a son who is an asthmatic, and asthma is considered a chronic illness. I brought along a photo of him for you to see. His name is Ethan, and he's 2.5. And also I brought along his nebulizer, which is a machine that dispenses medication, and it comes out in an aerosol form for him to breathe. And so normally you don't see a 2-year-old who has to, if he's having some respiratory difficulties, who needs to have a machine like this. And so my family, who I would consider very typical, is one that would have been considered not typical and undesirable during this time period. The beginnings of eugenics can be traced back to Sir Francis Galton in 1863. He hypothesized that if people who exhibited desirable qualities, physically, socially, and intellectually, only married or mated with others who had the same qualities, the result would be offspring that had even more of the desirable qualities. Galton's ideas were coupled with the principles of hereditary from Gregor Mendel's research with plants. Mendel's research showed that you could pollinate two specific types of plants to produce genetically superior offspring plants. Galton's ideas and Mendel's ideas were fused together and imported into the United States and embraced by the ruling elite. This quote from War Against the Weak by Edwin Black sums up why the ruling elite so readily accepted the ideology of eugenics. And I quote, "In an America reeling from immigration upheaval and torn by post-Reconstruction chaos, race conflict was everywhere in the early 20th century. Elitists, utopians, and so-called progressives fused their smoldering race fears and class bias with their desire to make a better world. They reinvented Galton's eugenics into a repressive and racist ideology. Their intent? Populate the earth with vastly more of their own socioeconomic and biological kind and little or none of everyone else." End quote. Now that I have discussed the origin of eugenics, I will share with you some of the laws that were directly influenced by the idea of eugenics in the United States. Financed by American giants like the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Institute, eugenics was widely accepted. The Immigration Act of 1924, signed into law by President Coolidge, supported by Harry Laughlin, director of the Eugenics Record Office, sought to limit immigration from dysgenic immigrants such as Italians and East European Jews. The Virginia Racial Integrity Act made it illegal for a white person to marry anyone who was of any blood except Caucasian. The only exception made was for those who had 1/16 American Indian blood, who for this purpose would be considered white. The 1914 Model Sterilization Act made it legal to forcibly sterilize anybody who was determined to be socially inadequate. To quote wording from the act itself, this included, and I quote, anyone maintained wholly or in part on public expense, including the feeble-minded, insane, criminalistic, epileptic, inebriate, diseased, blind, deaf, deformed, and dependent, and also to include ne'er-do-wells, tramps, homeless, and paupers, end quote. And finally, and possibly the most influential legal affirmation of eugenics was the Supreme Court case Buck versus Bell. Carrie Buck, the case against Carrie Buck was fabricated by various supporters of eugenics, who sought to prove that illegitimacy and feeble-mindedness were hereditary traits that could be passed down from generation to generation. After giving birth to an illegitimate daughter at age 17, Carrie Buck was taken to the same asylum, the Virginia colony, where her mother Emma was. Overlooking the fact that Carrie's parents had indeed been married, and Carrie had been impregnated by a member of her foster family, officials at the Virginia colony and Harry Laughlin chose to use Carrie to validate the Virginia Eugenical Sterilization Act. Carrie's daughter Vivian was examined by a nurse at age 6 months who determined that, quote, there is a look about it that is not quite normal, end quote. Another expert from the Eugenics Record Office who examined Emma, Carrie, and Vivian stated that Vivian, again at age 6 months, was, quote, below the average and likely to be feeble-minded as well, end quote. In his opinion for Buck versus Bell, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes upheld the Virginia Eugenical Sterilization Act. He remarked that, and I am quoting him, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Carrie Buck was the first person then sterilized under the law. In closing, I'd like to share another quote from War Against the Weak by Edwin Black. And I quote, ultimately, eugenics practitioners coercively sterilized some 60,000 Americans, barred the marriage of thousands, forcibly segregated thousands in colonies, and persecuted untold numbers in ways we are just learning, end quote. I have spent a total of nearly 15 years being educated, elementary school, high school, college, and I have never once heard the term eugenics associated with any type of American activity. I am not an activist or a reformer, but I have to wonder why we continue to sweep the sins of our nation under the rug. The lessons to be learned from history are important, and I believe that we must not gloss over the dirty deeds for fear that these lessons will too soon be forgotten. Thanks.